Imagine standing at the edge of a racetrack, watching the man who taught you everything, the man who was like a father to you, climb into a car for the last time. You buckle his helmet. You shake his hand. You look him in the eyes. And then you watch him disappear down the quarter mile and never come back. That moment happened to Greg Anderson when he was just 22 years old. And 40 years later, at 65, he says he still feels it like it was yesterday. But here's the thing about Greg Anderson. That moment didn't break him. It built him. It turned a heartbroken young kid from Duluth, Minnesota, into the most winning pro stock drag racer in the entire history of the NHRA. And yet, even after 6 world championships, over 112 career wins, and a legacy that no one in his sport may ever match, the tragedy never left him. Because some wounds don't heal. They just get carried. Greg Anderson was born on March 14, 1961, in Duluth, Minnesota, a tough, working-class city on the edge of Lake Superior where winters are brutal and people don't have the luxury of giving up. His father raced in NHRA Division 5, a hobbyist-level competitor who introduced his son to the raw, visceral world of drag racing before Greg could even fully understand what he was watching. But he didn't need to understand it. He felt it. The roar of the engines, the smell of the rubber burning against the asphalt, the quarter mile that seemed to swallow everything, fear, doubt, time itself. Through those track visits, Greg and his father befriended a man named John Hagen, a Motorsports Pro Stock racer with a big personality, a heart bigger than his engine, and 2 young kids who he'd carry a picture of inside his helmet. When Greg's father eventually stepped away from racing, it was John Hagen who took the young Greg under his wing. Hagen gave him a purpose. He gave him a career. He gave him a home. Literally. Greg lived at Hagen's house, traveled the country with him, learned everything from tuning the car to reading a racetrack to understanding what it took to compete at the highest level. I considered him like a second father to me, Anderson would later say. He was a super nice guy. I spent so much time with him. I learned everything from him. And then one day in 1985, at Brainerd International Raceway in Minnesota, John Hagen's home state, everything changed. The qualifying run was supposed to be routine. Greg Anderson, as he always did, helped buckle Hagen into his Dodge Charger. He watched Hagen do his ritual, the one he did before every single run. Kissed a picture of his 2 kids tucked inside his helmet. Put the helmet on. Shake Greg's hand. And go. They shook hands. Hagen pulled forward to the starting line, and then the car launched. At 170 miles per hour, something went catastrophically wrong. The Dodge Charger barrel rolled down the track with no guard walls to stop it, no barriers to absorb the impact. There was nothing, just open track and a car spinning out of control at nearly 3 times highway speed. Greg Anderson ran. He ran down that track as fast as his legs would carry him toward the wreckage. What he found when he got there, he has never been able to fully erase from his memory. It was the most gruesome scene that you'd ever seen in your life, Anderson said. It was horrific. John Hagen did not survive. Anderson was 22 years old, standing in the wreckage of the man he called a second father, realizing that the last thing he had done before this was shake his hand. That was the last human contact John Hagen ever had. And it was Greg. That experience didn't just break his heart. It shattered his identity. He walked away from racing entirely. He went back to his family's car dealership, put on a different kind of uniform, and tried to be a normal person in a normal world. But anyone who has ever felt the pull of a racetrack knows you can leave the sport, but the sport never really leaves you. 2 years passed. 2 long, quiet, grief-soaked years. And then Greg Anderson went back to Brainerd for the Nationals. Not to race, just to watch, just to remember. Standing in the stands, he ran into Kurt Johnson, son of Warren Johnson, the legendary 6-time Pro Stock champion. One conversation led to another. And suddenly, Greg Anderson was being offered position working with Warren Johnson's team as a crew chief. It wasn't driving. It wasn't the dream. But it was the track. And it was enough. What happened next was extraordinary. Under Greg Anderson's tuning and mechanical genius, Warren Johnson won 3 Pro Stock championships in 1992, 1993, and 1995. Anderson wasn't in the spotlight. He was behind the scenes, building engines, reading data, finding tenths of a second that no one else could find. He was a ghost in the machine. a legend operating in the shadows. But the racing blood that John Hagen had put in his veins never stopped pumping. And in 1998, at 37 years old, an age when most athletes are writing their memoirs, Greg Anderson made his debut as a full-time NHRA Pro Stock driver. The world had no idea what was coming. In 2003, just 5 years into his driving career, Greg Anderson won his first NHRA Pro Stock World Championship. Then he won it again in 2004, and then again in 2005. 3 consecutive championships. Nobody in his class had ever done that. The sport didn't know whether to applaud him or be afraid of him. He won again in 2010, again in 2021, at 60 years old, and then, almost impossibly, in November 2024, at 63 years of age, Greg Anderson walked into a post-race press conference with a 6th NHRA Pro Stock World Championship in his hands. 6, the most in the history of Pro Stock. He had beaten kids half his age, driven a Chevrolet Camaro to a record-setting 6.505-second run, defeated a 29-year-old Aaron Stanfield, and edged his own teammate by just 0.002 seconds at Pomona, California. "They are trying to push me out the door," he said with a smile, talking about the young guns nipping at his heels. "So I'm dragging my feet. I'm not going." The crowd laughed, but behind that smile was something deeper. Something that no championship belt or trophy could capture. Because here's the tragedy of Greg Anderson, the part that doesn't fit on a trophy. He has spent his entire career racing for a man who never got the chance to see any of it. Every time Greg Anderson buckles into a race car, he thinks about John Hagen. Every time he crosses a finish line, he wonders what John would have said. Every single race. For over 25 years as a driver, he has carried the ghost of the man who gave him everything, including the reason to come back. "I miss him every day," Anderson said in 2024, 40 years after Hagen's death. He was such a great guy. He still talks to Hagen's family, still calls them. When the NHRA went back to Brainerd years later, Anderson drove to the #1 qualifying spot in John Hagen's honor. When the sport finally installed guard walls at national events, a safety reform that came directly as a result of John Hagen's death, Anderson quietly acknowledged that something meaningful had come from something devastating. But he also knew it shouldn't have taken a death to make it happen. "That's the way it works," he said. "You kind of have to have tragedy to learn and go forward. That's what he's responsible for." Think about that. The man who died on that track in 1985 is responsible for making every NHRA race safer today. His death changed the infrastructure of the sport forever. And the man who buckled his helmet that last morning, who shook his hand, who ran down the track in horror, that man went on to become the greatest pro stock driver who ever lived. Not in spite of the tragedy, because of it. That is a weight that doesn't go away at 65. It doesn't go away with 6 championships. It doesn't go away when the crowd cheers or the sponsors call the cameras roll. It lives in the quiet moments, in the memory of a handshake, a ritual, a picture of 2 kids tucked inside a helmet. In 2025, Greg Anderson became only the 2nd driver in NHRA history to reach 1,000 round wins. He also reset the Pro Stock national elapsed time record to 6.443 seconds. At 64 years old, he was not only still racing, he was still breaking records, still making history, still refusing to let anyone write the final chapter of his story. And now, at 65, he is still out there, still driving for KB Titan Racing, still wearing the HendrickCars.com Chevrolet Camaro, still chasing perfection that he may have first learned about from a man in a Dodge Charger at a Minnesota racetrack more than 4 decades ago. The sport has been trying to retire Greg Anderson for years. The young drivers have been trying to out-qualify him, outdrive him, outlast him, and every year he shows up again. Not because he has something to prove, but because walking away, truly walking away, would mean leaving behind something he is not yet ready to leave. Some people call it stubbornness. Some call it passion. But if you understand the story of Greg Anderson, if you understand the 22-year-old who ran down a racetrack and found wreckage where his mentor used to be, you understand that it is something else entirely. It is devotion. It is grief turned into purpose. It is a man who made a silent promise over the wreckage of a crashed race car and has spent 40 years keeping it. The tragedy of Greg Anderson is not that he lost someone. We all lose someone. The tragedy is that he has had to live every victory knowing that the person who made those victories possible never got to see a single one. The tragedy is that the greatest moment of his career, 6 championships, 112 wins, 1,000 round victories, exists in a world from which John Hagen was taken too soon. And somehow, that doesn't make Greg Anderson's story smaller. It makes it immeasurably larger. Because the most heartbreaking thing about Greg Anderson at 65 is not that he is old. It is that every single mile he has raced, every burnout, every launch, every trophy, all of it has been a letter to a man who couldn't read it. A love letter written in elapsed times and championship banners, addressed to someone who kissed a photograph, put on a helmet, and shook his hand one last time. If you made it this far, do me one favor. Share this story. Not for the views, but because Greg Anderson's name deserves to be spoken by more people who understand what it actually cost him to become who he is. And if you're new here, subscribe, because stories like this are exactly why this channel exists.